It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Not that the two speakers we just had preceding Dan are not keynote speakers. Those were phenomenal remarks. But Dan, as you know by now, is the author of the widely heralded book, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes. And by the way, copies of the book, and I consider this a must-read book for all of us at the lake, are available for sale in the lobby if you haven't already picked one up. And I want to thank the Open Door Bookstore from J Street in Schenectady, who will donate 10 to 15% of book sales today, done here, to the Fund for Lake George. So I want to thank the Open Door Bookstore. Dan's already, and I'd say already, seminal and policy guiding book on how aquatic invasive species have decimated the Great Lakes. And by the way, the Great Lakes represent 20% of all the fresh water on this planet, is a siren call to New York State, to the Adirondacks, and to here at Lake George. That call to action is simply this, that any unchecked advance of invasive species puts at risk everything we hold precious about this region, and most of all about this beloved place we call Lake George. Dan is a native of Green Bay, Wisconsin. He grew to love Lake Michigan by spending weekends with his family on vacations on the Door Peninsula, for those of you who know that area, where both sets of his grandparents had summer homes. Kind of reminds us about a lot of the early childhoods we had at parents' and grandparents' summer homes here on this lake. Today, Dan is a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. He received his master's degree in environmental journalism from Columbia University and has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. To me, The Death and Life of the Great Lakes portrays the reality that freshwater is indeed the global strategic asset of this century, and protecting it should be a non-negotiable priority. Please join me in a warm Lake George welcome for Dan Egan.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. I got to know, when does my 20 minutes start? Because I'm being asked to talk about 10 years worth of work in 20 minutes. I've had to do it before, so I can do it, but it's always a challenge. I'm really happy to be here. I have to say, I started my trip here from the middle of my own vacation up on the Door Peninsula in Wisconsin, and my wife was not that happy that I was leaving her and our 4 school-age kids, and she'd be really ticked if she were here and saw where I came. She probably would wish that I had brought him along. It really is spectacular. I've never heard the term the Queen of the American Lakes, and it makes me wonder what the king is, but I got a pretty good idea for an argument. Here's a bunch of big lakes. These are the 5 Great Lakes. It's not the typical orientation south to north. It's looking west to east, and I like it because it kind of helps you think of these lakes as a system, which is what they are. In a sense, they are kind of a slow motion river. It starts at the headwaters at Lake Superior, there at the bottom. That's about 600 feet above sea level. And you can't really see the rivers here, but Lake Superior flows down into Lakes Michigan and Huron. And then that great lakey looking thing off of Lake Huron is Georgian Bay. If the Bruce Peninsula would have finished its job, it would have been its own Great Lake, but it's part of Huron. Huron flows down into Lake Erie. Lake Erie, of course, tumbles over Niagara Falls. And I have to say, when I first started covering Great Lakes issues for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, I was stunned at how little people even who live on Great Lakes know about them. There was a mid-level editor at the paper who thought that Niagara Falls came in from the ocean into the lakes. So I assume nothing. And it's humbling because you don't know what you don't know sometimes. Anyway, and from Lake Ontario, all these waters gather in the St. Lawrence River and make their run out to the ocean. So it's a dynamic system. These aren't steady state, stable bodies of water. They're constantly flowing west to east. And here's a kind of a schematic of that kind of gives you an idea of how the whole thing works. Now, these are big lakes. There's 5 of them. They collectively span 94,000 square miles, which is about the size of the United Kingdom. And so I think one of the problems that these lakes face is that they're called lakes, and they really are something more than that. But vast as they are, they, here's a picture of the Great Lakes Basin. I'll explain why this matters. Big as these lakes are, before white settlement, they were as isolated as a spring-fed pond in the middle of northern Wisconsin or here in the Adirondacks, and that's because they didn't really have a hydrologic or aquatic connection to the outside world. Yes, the St. Lawrence River gathered all this water and flushed it out to the ocean, but I can't go backwards with these slides, but when you see the relief, when you see how much head there is between the lakes, it becomes apparent that things weren't going to just fin their way in, particularly at Niagara Falls. You know, that's a 170-foot limestone cliff, but also, and that would protect all the lakes from Lake Erie to Huron, Michigan, and Superior. Lake Ontario had significant protection as well because the natural St. Lawrence River was, a roaring torrent. I can't remember the exact footage drop from Kingston to Montreal, but it's on the order of at least the size of Niagara Falls, a couple hundred feet. There were big waves that were impassable. And it was a closed aquatic system that we just couldn't leave alone. So in the ditch digging to try to be able to bring boats in from the East Coast started in the 1600s in piecemeal fashion, largely along the St. Lawrence River so we could get up into Lake Ontario. But the first big crack in this protective border, and I just have to quickly say, so I'm talking about this protection on the east, but on the west as well, that green line that green area is the Great Lakes Basin, and that dotted line is the basin dividing line. And that dividing line is not like the crested ridges of the Rocky Mountains. It's almost an imperceptible hump in the landscape in certain areas, but it's just as important as a continental divide because it kept the waters of the Mississippi River Basin, which spans 40% of the continental U.S., from naturally mixing with the Great Lakes. So the Great Lakes were their own show for a while. The first chink in their armor, the first cracking open of the door, happened in 1825 with the opening of the Erie Canal, which was just a phenomenal development to help settle the inland states. It's small. It's a small little operation by today's standards, but it was tremendous in bringing in goods and bringing in people into the heart of the continent. It was all American. It connected Lake Erie at Buffalo to New York Harbor via the Hudson River and then the canal system. The Canadians weren't going to let us get away with having our own connection to the heart of the continent. So they started building their own network system, and they were always much more ambitious. You can see the barge. I don't remember the dimensions of the barges early on, but they were like 40 feet long, and they drew maybe 3 feet of water or something. It was, a relatively small-scale operation. Canadians always wanted to bring ships in, not just from the eastern seaboard, but from around the world. And they started, their first big effort at that was the opening of the Welland Canal, which allowed boats to go from Lake Ontario around Niagara Falls and up into Lake Erie. And they kept expanding that Welland Canal. The first one was finished in 1829, just 4 years after the Erie was done. They kept expanding it through the 1930s to the point where they were able to bring in boats that are 760 feet long. They draw nearly 30 feet of water. They're nearly 80 feet wide. They were behemoths of the time. But they were also kind of like ships in a bottle because they couldn't get out the St. Lawrence River because that had yet to be tamed to that degree. So that's where the St. Lawrence Seaway comes in. In the 1950s, the U.S. and Canada finally got together. Oh gosh, I thought I was going to push ahead here. They got together and they agreed to build once and for all a deep draft navigation corridor that would link the middle of the continent to the eastern seaboard and to ports all around the globe. I mean, on a map, it's two-dimensional, it looks obvious. On the ground, as we saw in that earlier schematic, there was just no natural way to get a boat up here. Well, the Seaway was the unnatural way to do it. And what we did was we built locks to be able to skirt all the rapids and the torrent that was the St. Lawrence River. But the problem was we didn't build it to modern standards in the 1950s. Okay, the Welland Canal, the last Welland Canal opened in the 1930s. And so we built it on the cheap, and I think it was done because the East Coast didn't really want rival ports and the railroads didn't want rivals. So they said, let's just match these Welland Canal locks with the new Seaway locks, and we'll be good with that. It's hard to comprehend how excited people were about this at the time. People in Duluth and Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Toronto, they were convinced that we were about to become port cities every bit as much as anything on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, or the West Coast. And the first year the Seaway opened in 1959, there was, plenty of exotic bounty coming in because it was kind of like the beta test for the system. And there were boats coming in from all over the world. This is from my Milwaukee Journal, 1959, and there are models down on the docks showing off the fashions that were being brought in, and there's articles written about the furs and the olives and the liquors and all this exotic bounty, everything that we were hoping for. But that was the last year that happened. The problem was the Seaway was really built too small. And unfortunately, for the timing of the construction, the first container vessel sailed in 1956. The Seaway was built between 54 and 59. And the containerization of cargo demanded ever bigger ships. So when this Seaway opened, it was basically obsolete the day it opened. I mean, here's a modern freighter. This boat couldn't even poke its nose into the Seaway locks. This is a Seaway vessel. It's the dimensions that these boats were in the 1930s, pre-World War II fleet. It's about 760 feet long and 78 feet wide, and it can't handle the containers that the world's fleet now relies upon or now uses. What we have here basically is it's almost like a narrow gauge railroad. We have a boutique navigation system. These boats bring in foreign steel, at least for now. They bring in the foreign steel, and they take out North American grain. And on average, about 2 of these ships arrive every day, and to leave the system. That's not what we were hoping for. That's not a lot of cargo. That's about what one single 100-car train could do, coming in from the East Coast and going out from the Midwest to the East Coast. So we didn't get the cargo that we had all hoped for, but we did get some stuff that we didn't hope for. The Seaway opened in 1959, and since then it's a running total. I think there's 61 non-native species. Many of them invasive. The difference between non-native and invasive is basically your own opinion, and I think everybody would share the opinion that these zebra and quagga mussels are invasive species. Nothing's been more damaging than these drycenid mussels that came from the Caspian and Black Sea basin, and they came aboard an overseas freighter sailing up the Seaway in the ballast tank of this freighter. Ballast is used to stabilize a less than full cargo boat on the open seas, and it's every bit as critical to its safe operation as flaps are on a plane. You don't mess with ballast water. It's critical, but it's not dead weight. And we've got now 61 species. In the last 2 years, there's been 2 new forms of zooplankton discovered in Lake Erie. And who knows what the impacts are going to be. These mussels, at first, were just a rare find in 1986. And those were zebra mussels. Behind the zebra mussels came quagga mussels. And you guys, I understand you have some zebra mussels. You do not want quagga mussels. Quagga mussels are literally 10 times worse, and that's because they don't need hard bottom, hard substrate to colonize. They can thrive on sandy bottoms. They can thrive at almost any depth, and they filter year-round. And it may be hard to see on this map, but the bottom, the quagga mussels did what nobody thought anything could do, and that was they eradicated zebra mussels in a very short period of time, and they now smother the lake bed at densities up to 100,000 per square meter, which blows your mind if you think about, okay, they're maybe a thumbnail size. How do you fit 100,000 of them on a square meter? Well, they stack almost like coral, and each one can filter a liter of water a day, and they're filtering the plankton out of the water column to the point where plankton levels are now at points some of the year 10% of what they were. That's the bottom of the food chain. You take out the bottom of the food chain, so goes everything above it. These are the forage fish numbers on Lake Michigan, and you can see the first zebra was discovered in Lake Erie in 1986, I believe. And you can just watch this thing drop off a cliff, and that's the food source that sustains the Great Lakes recreational fishery, which is valued at billions of dollars. The salmon fishery on Lake Huron is now gone. That's kind of a grainy picture, but that's a Chinook salmon that should be twice that weight, and that's because it's got nothing to eat, and that's because the mussels have sucked so much of the life out of the water. This is the sad tale of the front door. I'm going to shift gears real quickly to the back door. I mentioned earlier on that map, we had a map of the Great Lakes Basin, and you could see a dotted line, and it got remarkably close to the Lake Michigan shoreline at Chicago. Chicago used Lake Michigan as its drinking water source. It still does today. Chicago also used to use Lake Michigan as its toilet. It flushed its raw sewage into the city, or into the lakes in the city's drinking water intakes, and people were getting sick. So they did something bold and ambitious and really smart by 19th century standards. They punched a hole in this subcontinental divide to link Lake Michigan with the Mississippi River Basin to flush their sewage downstream, and hope it was diluted enough by the time it got to St. Louis. But don't feel bad for St. Louis; they send New Orleans enough stuff. It's true. But this didn't only just carry sewage, it carried Great Lakes invaders, and we started to really realize that in the 1990s when zebra mussels rode those waters out into the Mississippi River Basin, as I mentioned earlier, covers 40% of the continental United States. And once they were in the Mississippi River Basin, it was off to the races. These things attached to the hulls of boats, and wherever a boat goes, it doesn't have to go with the current, it can go upstream, the mussels are gonna go. They can also get trailered by boats, and that's how they made the jump over the Continental Divide back in 2007 over the Rocky Mountains. Just real quickly, I was driving up here on Highway 87 from the airport, and there was a boat being trailered up a hill, and water was dripping out the back, and as I was passing it, it literally said, it wasn't the name that the owner gave, it was the model. It was called the Invader. And I thought, yeah, that's appropriate. So this was, I think this is 2009, if you can just try not to look at his fingernails. That's two years after the first mussel was found in Lake Mead. By this time, if you do look at his hands, you can see all the cuts. He's a dock worker, and his hands were just getting shredded from this organism that nobody had heard of until all of a sudden it's a little story in the paper, and next thing you know, it is the dominant species in the lake. And now there's a ferocious fight, much like the one you guys are undertaking here, to keep these things from spreading into the Pacific Northwest, where they would really gum up the hydropower system of the Columbia River Basin to the tune of $1 billion annually, it's been estimated. But this highway that the Chicago Canal is for invasive species is a two-way street. This is a bighead carp. This is a long, sad, sorry tale I don't have time to tell here, but these fish were brought in by fish farmers, turned over to the state governments down south, funded federally in sewage treatment experiments where they would gobble up the sewage. They're filter feeders, much like the mussels are. And the idea was they could clean sewage lagoons, and then you could sell their fillets to fund more sewage treatment. And it was an elegant idea, but repugnant as well. And so with the arrival of the Reagan administration, they let these fish go because they never thought they'd reproduce in the wild. And guess what? They're really bad because they dominate the biomass of the lakes that they invade, up to the point where some stretches of the Illinois River are now 90% Asian carp, silver and bighead carp. That's 9 out of every 10 pounds of fish is Asian carp, and they jump at the whir of a boat motor. And you would not be able to recreationally boat on this lake if you had a silver carp infestation to the extent that they have on these rivers. A guy for the United States Geological Survey that I work with, he's on the Missouri River, and he literally doesn't go out without a hockey helmet on his boat. And it's scary. And this one day I went out with these guys. They caught 13,000 pounds of these fish in one morning, and they were frozen and shipped off to China. By comparison, the whole quota for perch on Wisconsin's Lake Michigan waters that year was 20,000 pounds. So he does this every day, every month that there isn't ice on the water. So it's just a complete upending of the system. And there's plans now to put some kind of a plug in this Chicago Canal, whether it's physical or they have an electric barrier now, but it's not really working. A physical plug would cost at least $3 or $4 billion. And there's not an interest in Chicago, right? There's not money in Chicago right now to pay for that. But it's important that we shut that door. But it's also important that we shut this front door, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it's not going to cost billions of dollars to do that. It already exists, actually. It's called the St. Lambert Lock, and every boat coming into the Great Lakes from anywhere in the world has to go through this 80-foot pinch point. I'm not saying don't let the boats in, but I'm saying we need to adequately treat this contaminated ballast water before we do let them in. The shipping industry acknowledges that it's a problem, but they've also resisted efforts. The EPA has been sued numerous times by environmentalists, and we finally have a program in place where ballast treatment systems will be required on all boats, and there's still some fighting over how stringent the discharge standards should be. And we almost lost this hard-fought gain just this spring when there was a movement afoot in Congress to pull Clean Water Act protections away from ballast water and have the shipping industry regulated exclusively by the Coast Guard, which is more appropriately worried about mariner safety than what could be lurking in a ballast tank, and there could be lots of things. This is one drop of magnified seawater, and as I said earlier, it's anything but dead weight, and federal regulators are just bracing for the next invader that nobody's heard of until they're here. This is all grim news, but I'm not going to stay grim. These invasions have kept coming since 1959, and as I mentioned, these mussels have locked up so much of the energy on the bottom of the lake that all fish species are struggling, almost. This would be known as a round goby, and it came from the same place as the quagga and the zebra mussels, the Caspian Sea Basin. It came the same way aboard an ocean-going freighter sailing up the seaway. These little buggers are nature-built to go to town on mussels. They have special teeth that can crack open those shells and unleash what would normally be a nutritional dead end and send that food up the food chain. And they are everywhere in the lake. Here's a picture of the bottom of Lake Michigan, and you can see those white dots are mussels. What you can't see at first are all the gobies. Okay, they're everywhere. And any fish that can figure out how to eat a goby is doing okay. Salmon in the Great Lakes, which were introduced, by the way, which some might argue is an invasive species. I don't know who would argue that, but it could be argued. Salmon are struggling. They will not deign to go to the bottom of the lake and bang their snouts out in these rocks and grub out a living on gobies. But native walleye will, native lake trout will. Whitefish aren't even piscivores, typically. Whitefish, if it's a goby or death, the whitefish will eat a fish, a goby. Fishermen are seeing them coming in with their cheeks ripped open, and they say they're seeing really evolution on the fly. They're seeing these native species adapt. So in a very real way, the top of the food chain on the Great Lakes now looks more like its old self than it has any time in the last 100 years. The bottom of the food chain's been turned upside down. That's kind of the reason this book that I wrote is titled Death and Life of the Great Lakes. The old lakes are dead. Long live the new lakes. And it won't be too long if we let a new invader through this pinch point, the St. Lambert Lock. Just think about it, just for a second. How many boat ramps there are on your lake alone. Think about how many lakes there are in North America. Think how difficult it is to stop one of these critters once it gets loose on the continent. And every one of them has to go through that door that you could basically throw a softball across. It's important that we use this strategically, because that's not a door just to the Great Lakes. You can look at it as a door to Lake George as well. It's a little over 20 minutes, but thank you.
Stay with me here for a minute. as I said in my opening remarks, Dan's book is a siren call. We don't want this to happen here. Lake George, no matter what we might think, is no longer an island. It's connected to the Adirondack Park, the Hudson River. It's connected to Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence River. So we have the best invasive species prevention program in the eastern United States, and we want to do everything we can to expand it. So I think, Dan, if you haven't read Dan's book, please buy it, please read it. It's riveting, but it's also informative. And to thank Dan, I would also like to give you, this is actually a hacker, infused with the image of Lake George. And again, thank you to Al Ryder for this, but I'd like to read this to you all. Presented to Dan Egan for your vision and voice in bringing the catastrophic impacts of invasive species to a worldwide audience. Thank you for your vision and leadership.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.